Hey, hello, Americans and U.S. history students. Welcome to our lecture on Manifest Destiny and America's march west during the early to mid 1800s. So here we go. Let's jump right in. Heading west is part one. So ideas of heading west. Got a couple quotes here to start things out. American pioneer, when God made man, he seemed to think it best to make him in the east and to let him travel west. Again, even that idea of Western civilization, a lot of people had traced our heritage from heading west, starting in the Middle East and then into Turkey and then into the Roman Empire, then to England and into the New World, and then, of course, from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. And so that idea of heading west, which has always represented, again, because the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, had always kind of represented the future. And that very much captured the imagination of the early Americans, that there was always this opportunity, just head towards the horizon, and who knows what new chances you might be able to make yourself. So the West is a huge part of understanding what it means to be an American. This idea of, hey, we're going to travel, we can always travel west and start over again. And then we get a quote from John Lewis O'Sullivan, who we're reading his other article, the Great Nation of Futurity. But here's where we get the phrase manifest destiny. Our manifest destiny is to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent which Providence God has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty and federated self-government entrusted to us. And so here we have the goddess of liberty, or Providence, leading the settlers, the covered wagons, the stagecoaches, the miners. You can see the Indians and the buffalo fleeing. The trains are coming out. You can see the cities and the bridges and civilization there on the right, representing the east. And then, of course, the mountains and storm clouds and adventures and trials of life on the frontier. And that it was this destiny of the United States to inhabit the entire continent, Pacific or Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, for the purpose of the great experiment of liberty, that we have this new experiment, this new government that we've chosen for ourselves, unlike anything the world has ever seen. And we have this, again, God's given us this mandate, this mission, almost like the creation mandate of taking dominion over the entire world. But again, here the continent, in order to spread, again, federated self-government and liberty. And so that became kind of the encapsulating, again, message or mission statement of this drive into the west of the North American continent. Background on John Lewis O'Sullivan: he was a New York journalist, prominent Democrat. He's kind of a man of the people, man of the states, man of the frontier. Wrote for the United States Magazine and Democratic Review, just called the Democratic. But again, his goals were to promote Jacksonian democracy, which we could just call for this class democratization. More and more opportunity, more and more freedom, more and more equality for more and more people. And then also to develop American literature and democratic principles, as we talked about, that after the Revolution, the United States didn't have a lot of culture. They had to invent or develop their culture over time, and the move west in the name of democracy and equality becomes one of the kind of the founding themes of that, and was for Sullivan and other writers like him. So how did they get west? We talked about Lewis and Clark, but now we've got much more massive numbers. Primary jumping off point was famously Independence, Missouri. And then there were a couple of key prominent trails. There was the Cumberland Gap Trail, which is not pictured on here, but that was a way of crossing the Appalachian Mountains from kind of Virginia down into Tennessee area and Kentucky. You had the Santa Fe Trail, which was Independence, Missouri. You could see to Santa Fe. The Oregon Trail, which is a famous game, which many of you may or may not have played, but your parents probably have, heading from Independence, Missouri to Oregon City there in Oregon. The Mormon Trail, taken by the Mormon people as they were kicked out of Illinois, and then they sought a place where they could worship freely, and they ended up at Salt Lake City, blazed a trail that others could follow west. And then, of course, the California Trail, heading out to San Francisco, which again became a major route for gold seekers after 1849, when gold was discovered in Northern California. So primary means of when we say heading west at this time, that the routes that they were taking. So now it's new territories. Our second point, let's talk about some of the new territories that entered the Union at this time. First, Texas. the background there, American settlers were actually invited into Texas by the Mexican government. It was lightly populated, underdeveloped, and they thought, let's get some Mexican government thought, let's get some settlers in here, some farmers, some cattle ranchers, and we'll assimilate them, and then we'll develop that area, and we can maybe eventually make them citizens. Well, it kind of backfired because all these Americans settled in that area, again, originally by permission, but they didn't assimilate. They kept speaking English. They didn't convert to Catholicism. They were mostly Protestant. They were told by Mexico to leave their slaves behind, but they brought their slaves anyway. They said you could eventually become subjects of the Mexican government. They said, no, we're going to remain Republicans under American government. And that all leads to, again, we've talked about the Alamo in class. That these American settlers in northern Mexico to seek their own independence. Mexico began to, once they saw they weren't assimilating, began to encroach upon what the settlers thought were their freedoms, and so they used that as, realizing they were no longer be able to live as freely as they thought in this new Texas territory. They sought independence. Started first the Alamo, but then that, of course, the major battle being that of San Jacinto in 1836. In which Santa Anna was defeated, and the Republic of Texas was born. So again, it was not a war between the United States and Mexico. It was American settlers who had been invited into Texas, but then decided to break away. And America, basically, for the first, I think it was 10, 12 years, said, no, you're not. We didn't condone that, at least not officially. Though many Americans migrated in there to help with the revolt, but they were a republic, an independent nation. For at least a decade, and then finally got state, or you can say 9 years, 1836 to 1845. Then they achieved statehood and finally joined the United States after being an independent country for 9 years. And so that's anyway. Sorry, Miss Stride was waving to me, so I got distracted. Another territory is the Oregon Territory. Again, if you remember Lewis and Clark's, the Louisiana Purchase did not go all the way to the Pacific Ocean, but that was always kind of the hope and the intent. And so at this time, the Oregon Territory is a joint occupation between Britain and America. Both have access there, and it's kind of a question of, well, who's going to settle it first? And the Oregon Trail was a real big drive to say, hey, let's fill that territory with American settlers and establish American industry so that we can lay claim to that territory. And you can see in the 1840s is a mass migration to the Oregon Territory or Oregon country along that trail, 200 to approximately 300,000 within a decade. The first trailblazers were actually missionaries going out to reach out to the Native Americans in that region. And in 1846, the United States and Great Britain signed a treaty where they essentially split the Oregon territory or country in half along the 49th parallel. You can see that going there. So England got the top, which would eventually become part of Canada, and America got everything below the line. Originally, some Americans wanted it all the way up to that 5440 line. There were slogans about trying to lay claim to that, but the compromise reached was pretty much the split there. And so that ends up adding the Oregon Territory, which would eventually be made into states like Idaho, Washington, and Oregon, maybe parts of Montana, to the United States. And then the last piece we're going to talk about is the Mexican Cession. And these are the territories given to the United States following the Mexican-American War. And so this is independent than Texas. Texas was its own kind of independence movement and then eventual republic and then joined the United States. And it was after that, in 1846, that the United States, again, the Battle of San Jacinto is in 1836, so it's 10 years later that the United States and Mexico get into a border dispute about, what is the actual border of Texas, because now Texas is part of the United States, and Mexico says it's this river, and the United States says it's this river, and so there's this disputed territory between those two rivers, and they use a clash along the border as justification for declaring war on Mexico. We'll be discussing how this was kind of controversial and almost seemed provoked by the United States. They were very, very eager to find a justification. In fact, the United States had offered to buy New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and California from Mexico. They said, no way. I think they offered maybe $20 million for it. And so this border dispute provided a justification for going to war. It's relatively uneventful. Most of the fighting takes place down in Mexico proper. They invade Mexico City, and the war ends in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and adds the states you see listed there to the United States and then they do end up paying some for the territory, but not the price they originally offered, but $15 million. And so as a result of the war, the yellow territory there is ceded to the United States. And so we could kind of look at 1848 as that moment at which the United States, again, they added both the Oregon country in that year and then also the Mexican cession. And so the United States had very rapidly spread all the way to the Pacific Ocean. They weren't yet states, but now they're officially United States territory. And again, you see there in the gray the disputed territory that led to the declaration of war in the gray. All right, so here we'll be working on a map like this, so you can kind of map out each of these territories. But you now have the continental United States. We didn't talk about the purchasing of Florida in 1819, some smaller ones at the bottom, or even the Gadsden purchase. But the general chunk, you can see the Texas annexation of 1845. Again, they earned their independence 9 years earlier. The Oregon Territory, 1846, not 1848. And then the Mexican cession. But if you just look at those dates, 1845, 1846, 1848, you can see what a rapid movement this was, a drive to add this territory to the United States. That was the goal. And again, whether it was competition with the British, whether it was independence of Texas nationals in Mexican territory, or even the border dispute, that's what the United States was gunning for. So consequences to this expansion and this concept of manifest destiny, this divine call to span the continent, spreading the constitutional republic or federated republicanism. One is it helped fuel and establish what we would consider kind of the early American character, the idea of independence, the idea of the rugged individual heading west and making, no matter where he was born or whatever his background, he could make whatever he could of himself just through the opportunities out there, hard work, perseverance, ingenuity, how to take what looks like a rugged wasteland and create it into opportunity or economic provision, and of optimism that, there's always, like I said, we can always just head west, young man. We can always just keep going over the next hill and we can start over and there's a new opportunity. And so these characteristics listed here really kind of become the American character, which you could back all those up, and those are some of the same things of the original colonists coming across the Atlantic to the original 13 colonies, but by this continued movement west, they are preserved and cultivated and even more deeply entrenched in American culture. Other consequences that I would put down as positive is you have the spread of American or Western civilization into these regions. You have a lot of times it's missionaries leading the way. You have the spread of Christianity. You have the principles of self-government, government of the people, not of a king or not of a monarch, not from an empire over in Europe. You have democracy and equality. Again, out in the wilderness, equality is more easily established. Again, we talked about the vote that Lewis and Clark took, or watched the video when they were way out off the map over the Pacific Ocean, because out in the environment, we are equal. You're at least as equal as what you're willing to try to do. There aren't all the other social mores and educational restrictions and taboos and stuff in place. And so the West is always this kind of place of cultivating more and more democracy and equality. And of course, freedom, because you have that freedom to do as you want and what you need to do in order to survive. And so these principles were spread across the continent along with these settlers as a consequence of this expansion. Slightly more dangerous or foreboding consequences is that it was this westward expansion that really set the stage for the Civil War. Every time new territory got added to the United States, it was like, well, the age-old debate, are we going to add this as slave territory or slave state or a free state? And again, that balance was crucial to keeping both sides happy because both sides were deeply entrenched in maintaining the status quo. And any sort of advantage on either side would be seen as an ability to then attack and change the Constitution, change the laws, and destroy, either expand slavery or completely eliminate slavery. Again, we talked about the Missouri Compromise that attempted to draw a line say free above, slave below. Then, as they added more territory here, they came up with what was called the Compromise of 1850. This was what actually brought California into the Union, and there it was said popular sovereignty. In other words, let the people in the region choose. So forget whether it's north or south. Once they form a state, they get to vote, and then they get to decide whether they're going to be slave or free. And when we talk about the Civil War, we're going to see how this actually led to a lot of violence, and again, a lot of danger and open hostile conflict. Again, eventually civil war. It also helped set the stage for the Civil War because, again, you look at the history of Texas, there's a precedent of revolt and secession. You know, that if your rights are violated, then like the Texans felt against Mexico, then we're going to revolt and we're going to secede. We're going to break away and form our own country. You have something similar going on in, Oregon or in the Mexican War. And so the South is going to, this is so the playbook when people feel like their rights are violated, well, we're just going to revolt and we're going to secede. Also, the Mexican-American War is a key training ground for the Civil War. All the chief combatants and veterans of the Civil War were trained and actually knew each other and fought alongside each other during the Mexican War. And that's actually one of the really kind of tragic elements of the Civil War is all these guys being brothers and remembering what it was like to take Mexico City and what it was like to travel through California together. And then they went back, and depending on whether they're Northerners or Southerners, they'd eventually be turned against each other. But again, it was this expansion that brought this tension to a head. So again, this was the Compromise of 1850 that indoctrinated popular sovereignty. The people of California voted to be free. Same thing with Oregon and the other territories. Whereas you see Texas became slave state, Oklahoma, and then Utah. Those orange stations were the ones yet to be determined. Who knew whether they could be slave or free? And eventually, there even became a threat. Is that like up in Minnesota, that wasn't necessarily going to be free. And if they decided to vote for an unpopular sovereignty, who's to say that you would have to, not, anyway. It also basically, there's no longer a guarantee of balance. So if more people voted for slavery, then maybe slavery would come to dominate the nation, or if more people voted for anti-slavery, vice versa. And so that trust or that feeling of, hey, we're in stalemate, hey, we're in balance, popular sovereignty really upset that and kind of raised the stakes. And the last consequence is just that it set the stage for American imperialism. That America, as much as there's this manifest destiny, and people are better off, and they need the Christian influence, they need the democratic, egalitarian influence. That it's a nation of free people. It was this idea that, well, we have the right to expand. God has given us a mandate to expand. The white race. We're going to read passages that kind of make it racial. The white race of America is superior, and therefore it's our job, it's our white man's burden to go into even beyond the Pacific Ocean to spread our ideals and our culture. And of course, there was a lot of opportunity, and so greed and violence built in. And so Manifest Destiny is a little bit of a complicated principle because there is a biblical and evangelical element to it, and even a beneficial and benign element, but there is pretty easily just on the flip side of the coin, all of these, the idea of imperialism. Well, we're going to do what's good for you, whether you like it or not. And as we'll see in a later unit, that doesn't just stop with California and the Pacific Ocean. That's going to lead us into the Pacific Ocean. It's going to lead us into Asia. It's going to lead us into the Caribbean. And the age-old temptation, as one were to grow in power and prominence, to say, hey, just like the Roman Empire, let's keep going, because what we're doing is good. And so even if there's a little bit of violence, a little bit of exploitation, a little bit of, kicking the Indians around and breaking treaties with them, or, picking a fight with the Mexicans, it's okay, because the ends justify the means, and it'll be good that these regions become part of the United States. That's kind of a dangerous path to go down, even when we get into issues of things like the invasion of Iraq more recently. And so this is kind of the moment to begin paying attention to that tension. And again, Americans are going to be very split. Not a lot of them who did not support some of these measures, particularly the war in Mexico. It was very, very controversial, and some Americans were abhorred with the fact that America seemed to be turning into a power-hungry empire. All right, so what? Manifest Destiny. First of all, the incredible speed at which it happened. The American settlers formed a continental nation nearly 60 years after they became a nation. Thomas Jefferson thought it would take generations to populate it. It seemed like a far-fetched dream, and then just 60 years of one generation, the United States went from 13 colonies to a continental nation. And as we've just been talking about, it's important that that's kind of a mixed blessing. For the world and the future, it's a benefit of the spread of American ideals, liberties, free markets, and capitalism and prosperity. Just kind of I call that self-evident superiority. In other words, you take an idea A, take idea B, you say, hey, choose. And people go, well, it's very clear that freedom, democracy, even your Christian faith, I choose that. That's self-evident that all men are created equal and they deserve life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's a good to spread that and offer that to these regions and spread it to these regions and give it that chance to embrace it. But on the flip side, you can run into what we just described, the idea of racism, of racial superiority, of using force to impose it upon people, and then even the greed that, oh, this is good for you, but obviously mainly because it's making me rich, giving me what I want. And that's what we call an assertive superiority. Again, you have kind of what we'd call maybe patriotism of loving your country and seeing the blessings of it versus nationalism, kind of imposing of your beliefs upon other people. And the expansion west, Manifest Destiny, kind of has elements of both worth paying attention to. And then, of course, it's a big deal because it is this expansion that sets the stage for the worst conflict in American history, costing far more American lives than any of the other, I think even all the other wars combined, which is, of course, what we'll finish this unit on, talking about the Civil War. All right, appreciate your hard work and your attention to these lectures, and I look forward to discussing all this with you in class. All right, see you soon.